There's an awful lot in this whole proposal we looked at. We were given to understand at the last meeting that there was a different approach taken in some of the European countries, and specifically the Nordic countries, to the idea of ensuring a pay-related pension for when you retire, and that it was much more state-based than the private sector model that we're proposing. I was wondering what examination had taken place in relation to the approach in the non-common law countries, in other words, to the European countries, as opposed to looking to Britain or even to America or whatever. Because we have a tendency always to look to Britain, and that's fair enough. It's nearest neighbour, it's where we inherited a lot of our approach to law. But we're always boasting about our membership of the European Union and new things they've brought to us. So I'm just wondering how much investigation was given to alternative models rather than the very private sector based model that we're going for. Now, the second issue that I think has been raised by Deputy Ó Cuív and that I raised the last day is investment in ethical funds. And what happens if it doesn't give us good a fiduciary return as investing, we say, in fossil fuels? And then we've got the definition, I think you pointed to this, the definition of an ethical fund. For example, we found that natural gas is included in the taxonomy. So who's going to define what an ethical fund is? Somebody out there or the Irish state? The third question that goes back, you said, well, you can't tell them where to invest because there might be better returns abroad. I think there's two issues that arise there. Because looking at Ireland Inc., by investing money in Ireland, one would hope to develop our economy, maybe put a lot of Irish-owned investment into wind energy off the coast. Very simple example. That's going to take billions and billions of equity. And not only are you getting the straight return on the fund, but you're getting the economic generator return on the fund, which is going to increase people's income, which is going to mean they're going to have a bigger fund anyway. So I think that's one we need to tease out better, because it's not a simple, I get X percent here and I get X, Y percent there. The next question I have is, well, you'll tell me we can't go where risk is an issue, and I accept risk is an issue. One of the reasons that I like the pay-as-you-go approach we have for our state funds is that we saw during the downturn how big an issue risk can be with investment in equities or other investments. My understanding is that when people get to a certain age, say within 10 years of coming to pension age, the funds are normally transferred out of the higher risk investments such as equities into bonds. And that one of the ironies in this country is that most pension funds in this state, operating in this state, invest in German bonds. Now, I defy anybody to say that investing in Irish bonds is a risk, Irish state bonds. I think the chance of the Irish government reneging on bonds, it has been well proven not to be true. Because even at the height, this caused a lot of debate. But the government held firm that bonds, your word was your bond, literally, for the future. And I think personally that was the right decision. So I don't see a risk in Irish bonds. They give a better yield normally than German bonds. And again, one has to question the wisdom of the Irish state pumping so much money into German bonds. So I think that's an issue I'd like to maybe get your take on. Now, If I'm asking too many questions, just tell me to stop. My next question relates to, my understanding is the state investment in cash. In other words, it's €1 to 3, isn't that correct? The employee puts in €3 and the state puts in €1, is that correct?
Yeah.
That's in replacement of the state foregoing income tax at the top end. In other words, at the moment, if I put in €100, I effectively get €40 off. If I'm on the 40% rate of tax, I get €20 off if I'm on the 20% rate of tax, and I get nothing off if I'm not paying income tax at all. And that this 30% is going to replace this. So you can argue that this is actually, for an awful lot of people, a reduction in the state input into their pension, not an increase. Now, if I'm correct, I think it begs another question. The most people who will be able to go outside auto enrolment and put more money into pensions are the well-to-do. So are we going to, or has this debate taken place with the Department of Finance, are we going to continue giving them a 40% discount, which is the same as giving them 40% cash input? It's the same thing, it has the same effect. Or are we going to allow them to get 40% and the rest get 30%? Or are we going to say, because this had been proposed by your department back in the day, that everybody would get 33%, I think was the figure that was hit on at the time. So you might outline that. Now, you were talking about replacement rates. And the great thing about state pension at the moment is that, give or take over the time I've been working, I think it has more than kept up with inflation. More than kept up with inflation. And that it's effectively better today than it was, we say, back in the 70s, in real terms, relative. However, my understanding is when I go out on my pension, the funded pension, that's it. Now, you talked about a replacement rate, say 60% or 70%. But my question is, have you analysed that if I retire at 66 or 65 and I get a replacement rate, we say of 60%, we just pick a figure out of the sky. If the average person is living into their 83, 84, 85, by the time I get to, say, 85, what's the real replacement rate taking inflation into account? Because remember, my state pension will keep going up, but this one has the disadvantage. It's just static, it's frozen in time. And if we get 10% inflation like we're getting at the moment, or 5% inflation, or an average of 3 or 4% inflation over what will nearly be 20 years, and in some cases will be well over 20 years, what kind of erosion, or have you calculated that? What kind of erosion is that going to place? Now, the other one that I think is going to weigh heavily on people is, to me, the reason that people can survive on 50, 60%, and I see this with pensioners coming into me all the time, and I think all of us who are working at the bottom end see this, that a couple, we say, getting 2 state pensions, €500 a week, it wouldn't, if you were working, be a huge salary. It would be a very small salary if you were paying the mortgage on a house. But traditionally, the vast majority of the people who are now pension age actually own their own property. Now, have you done comparisons between, to give you the same standard of living, have you done comparisons between the amount of money you need to get every week if you were paying the average commercial rent for your home, even allowing that you had downsized, which the people who own their houses have the great privilege of not having to do? And that's a debate, a much wider debate, because not everybody does downsizing suit. It doesn't particularly suit rural people because families, when they come home, tend to all pile into your house. So my question is, have you done an analysis as to the person who puts the money into the pension fund as a priority and rents the house, which we're told is the way to go and is the way of the future? I don't agree with it, but that's what we're told. Or the person who says, no, I'm going to own my house. So when I get to pension age, I'm going to own my house. And then what I get in state pension and private pension, I'll have to live on, but not to be paying out an ever-increasing mortgage as property prices go up, as they inevitably do over time. And have we done the analysis of those choices? I personally would have taken the second choice, own my house first and worry about the pension then. Because I always felt if you did wind up at the end and you owned the house, you could live in a more modest income. So have we done that? Modelling as to your choices, because these are the real world, and these are the kind of questions that people ask you when they come into a constituency clinic, because people think very smartly and very realistically about these issues. Thank you very much.
Mr. Duggan, a few questions there to answer.
Thanks very much, Deputy. Again, I'll try and take them in the order I think you asked them. So the pay-related pension issue and the state-based approach in other countries and so on. So yes, we've looked at systems in other countries. In fact, I've gone to Sweden and Denmark and talked to all the experts there in designing this. I think there's a little misunderstanding based on looking at the debate last week and some of the questions on exactly what goes on there. In exactly the same way that in Ireland and in every other OECD country there is a three-tier pension system, there's also one in Scandinavian Nordic countries. They have state pensions, occupational pensions and private pensions, exactly the same. Now, how they're made up varies a bit, but it's exactly the same structure. The Scandinavian countries typically have two parts to their state pension. They have a basic part, which everyone is entitled to, and I suppose could be represented by the non-con pension in Ireland. And they have a contributory part. So you get X and then you get more depending on the contributions that you've made. So it's pay related in that sense. But the combination brings you to roughly about the same type of situation that a person on a contributory pension in Ireland would be on. And in some cases less actually. So the state pension system in Scandinavian countries does not cover everything at all. Which is why in Scandinavian countries, they have an incredibly strong occupational pension pillar. It is compulsory in those countries, in the main, and it is through collective bargaining approaches that have been employed in Scandinavian countries for many, many, many decades at this stage. And so what you find in most companies over there is that they're part of the collective bargaining approach that's agreed centrally with government, and they have occupational pensions established, either individually or more likely on a sectoral basis. And there are mandatory contribution levels that have to be made into those pension schemes by both the employers and by the employees. So in that respect, it's not very dissimilar to what we're suggesting within auto-enrolment. In all of the cases that we looked at, those occupational arrangements, particularly on a sectoral level, are done through a central processing type entity. So the entity would do pretty much what we're talking about here. It would arrange for the collection of the contributions. It would arrange for the compliance of that to be upheld. It would arrange for the money to be invested in accordance with its standards and rules. and it would provide the participants with access to the details on all of that through portals and so on. So a very, very similar type approach in those occupational pensions to what we're suggesting here. And then they also have private pensions in exactly the same way that we do here, and people can avail of those in addition if they wish, or instead. And self-employed people in Scandinavian countries tend to use those a lot, private pensions rather than the occupational ones. And all of the big think tanks in the world, like the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, all of those advocate that three-tier system of a state provision, then an occupational provision, and then a private provision. Now, we have all that. It's just that an awful lot of people in Ireland have not had access to the occupational piece for decades. And the voluntary approach we've taken, as I said in the opening statement, just hasn't worked. Some really good companies have set up schemes and brought their employees into them. But because Ireland is hugely dependent on small, medium and even micro-sized enterprises, those types of organisations typically haven't. And that's why so few people in Ireland in the private sector are in those occupational schemes. It's entirely different in Scandinavia because it's the law established through collective bargaining. So that's the big difference. Well, from my investigations there anyway, Deputy, the whole thing about investment, I suppose the last thing to say about Scandinavia is that the way they have developed those occupational schemes, the centralised approach they've taken, that centralised management approach, has allowed them to achieve fee and charges rates of 0.5% and less. And so it's another reason for us to be confident that we can achieve that as well. The whole area of investment is, I'll go back to what I said to Deputy Ó Cuív, the paramount obligation of the CPA overseeing investments is their fiduciary duty to the participants. That's European law. And therefore, we can't, you can set standards and you can include ESG principles in those standards. But there's a fine line to be walked between doing that and tying the hands of the board of the CPA in conducting its fiduciary duty. And therefore care is needed. It's not that it can't be done, it just needs to be done with care. That's all. I mean, we're acutely aware that increasingly ESG funds are becoming much, much more important. They're performing much, much better than they used to in the past. Investors are taking them much more seriously. In some respects, they're developing kind of cachet status and they're becoming desired. And so we don't have a great deal of concern that it won't be possible to marry the two. The fiduciary duty on one hand and the desire for ensuring ethical investment in the other. We think it's absolutely possible to marry the two and achieve that. The trick we think with the CPA is that in the law we tell them what to do, but we don't tell them necessarily how to do it in detail, because the markets are ever changing and the structure and nature of them is ever changing. And if you tie the hands of the CPA too much, then they won't have that nimbleness to move to ensure the best interests of the participants. And that's always a consideration when dealing with the markets. The tax relief versus top-up.
No, the investment in bonds.
Oh, sorry, investment in bonds.
In other words, this last 10 years, I think it was some period anyway. And they tended to invest in German bonds, Irish pension funds, rather than Irish bonds.
Should yield better.
Even though the yield was better here, but they were saying there was a risk. Irish pension, couldn't get my head around it, still can't.
Yeah, I'm not, I mean, I accept your view. I don't know exactly what it is you want me to say about it, though. I think, you're right.
But why should, forget about the private part of it. This is big wad of state money. We're investing in German bonds instead of in Irish bonds that are giving a better yield. And just because a private industry creates an illusion that there's some risk with Irish bonds.
Well, no, remember, this is people's money, not the state's money. I know the state is topping it up, but the state is also topping up pensions in occupational and private pensions. So it's people's money. It's their own pot, their individual pot. It's not the state's pot. That's critically important. It's a really, really, really important piece of this. And so it's their interests that have to be served. It's their risk, so therefore it's their interests that have to be served, not the state's. And all I'm saying, it goes back to what I said, the fiduciary duty is the paramount thing, ensuring the best outcome for the participants of the scheme. Now, if it turns out that investing in Irish bonds when you reach the de-risking stages of the lifestyle is the most, is the best thing to do for the participants, then I don't see any reason why the CPA wouldn't do that.
But they don't.
Well, no, the CPA, remember, is going to be a state entity operating on behalf of the people that, it's not going to be a private commercial operation. And if it says that it wants things invested in Irish bonds, then the investment managers will have to follow those instructions. But equally, if Irish bonds are not performing as well as bonds elsewhere, then I think the same flexibility has to apply, that the CPA is capable of issuing investment instructions to ensure the best outcome for the participants of the scheme. And that I'll always fall back on that, Deputy, because it's people's money, not the state's money. So the top-up versus tax relief and all. So the way you set it out is correct. Right? Our analysis during the public consultation showed that the vast majority of people just don't get tax relief. I don't mean they don't get it, I mean they don't understand it. It's not obvious to them what it means or how it benefits them. That was really clear in the consultation that we did. I think, as Claire has often put it, people understand much better money that's given to them rather than money that's not taken away from them. And so tax relief is money that's not taken away from you, whereas the top-up is money that's given to you. And people understand that much, much better. And I think you've heard previous ministers describe this approach as akin to the SSIA. Well, it is, except it's much, much, much better than the SSIA ever was. So that's the first thing. It's about understandability. The second thing is about equity, about fairness. So you're right, somebody who pays tax at 40% would get tax relief at 40% and therefore would get a far bigger incentive from the government than somebody who pays tax at 20% or somebody who doesn't pay tax at all. And we took the view, and the minister took the view, and the government took the view that incentivising does not necessarily mean tax relief. What it means is incentivising, encouraging, helping people to do something, and that it should be fair. And regardless of your income level, in the income bands that auto-enrolment is going to cover, you should get the same level of incentive, regardless of your income band and regardless of how much tax you pay. And consequently, the government decided on the top-up approach rather than a tax relief approach. So that means that...
Can I just clarify now, because this is the point I made. The government consists of the 15 ministers. So what the government, to my understanding, and this I was looking for elucidation on, decided was that if you're in auto-enrolment, you get the top-up approach, straight cash approach. But if you continue in a private occupational pension, the government still gives you 40% off. So under one, you're getting 40% and 30. And the question I asked was the discussion with finance, so that finance would follow your lead and that they would only give 30% of the occupational pension relief, so that it would be equal to all. And that the good lead that you've given in one department would, on a total government, the government approach, be equal for those who are paying into their pension funds or wealthy and getting, at the moment, 40%. Because the original idea that the department you're in had was that everybody would get the same tax relief and pensions.
Has that engagement taken place with finance? Mr. Duggan.
There are always discussions going on with colleagues in finance about a whole host of things, this included. But what the government decided was for auto-enrolment, it would do a top-up at the rate of 3-to-1, and it would leave the existing system intact. That's what the government decided. But I don't accept the premise that people are losing out. The people who are going to auto-enrolment right now have nothing. They're getting no incentive for anything from anybody. They go into auto-enrolment, and for every €3, show my age, every €3 they put in, that will automatically become 7. And so they're not losing anything. They're gaining phenomenally. They're getting an incredible amount of, as some commentators have put it, free money. And that's what I mean by this being inordinately better than the SSIA approach that was there at the turn of the century, or after the turn of the century. So it's important to note that 75% of the people we expect will be auto-enrolled are either paying tax at 20% or at no rate at all. And so if we had applied tax relief to the auto-enrolment system, the vast majority of people would either get the low rate of incentive or no incentive of any kind from the state if you use the tax relief system. Whereas, in fact, those 75% are going to end up, it's going to be close to 600,000 people are actually going to end up better off in the auto-enrolment system than they would under the tax relief system. So that's why that approach has been chosen. It's far easier to understand, and it's far better for the vast majority of people that are going to be in it. And I know some commentators have said publicly and are probably saying to you in submission that this is going to create all kinds of confusion and all kinds of arbitrage with people trying to switch from one to the other and all the rest of it. And I think that there's a lot of hyperbole in that, to be honest. It's grossly overstated as an issue. Those people who are in occupational schemes will stay in them. Those people who are in none will come into auto-enrolment, and there will be occasions when people will go between the two, where they move from one job with a scheme to another job that doesn't have one, and they'll go into auto-enrolment, and then they may move back, and then they may have a choice of whether they go into the scheme in that company or stay in auto-enrolment. And there'll be some considerations at a personal level there, but the vast, 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 vast majority of people will not have any such confusion or arbitrage issues to deal with. State pension, keeping up with inflation and then erosion. You see, it very much depends on what you do when you get to retirement age, I think. So once upon a time, people used to take out annuities. And as you say, that's a fixed amount. And it don't much change, unless you buy one that has an inflation factor built into it, right? But annuities have kind of gone out of fashion in the sense they've become quite expensive, especially in this jurisdiction, more expensive here than they are in many other jurisdictions. And therefore, what people are doing increasingly and almost exclusively at this stage is maintaining investment. and they're using approved retirement funds or the like to keep their money invested, and then they're drawing it down as they need it. And so that means that the money is continuously growing, you would hope, because it's invested. And in the same way that economies inflate and expenditure inflates, so does investment and so on. So you would hope that that mechanism would allow the returns to keep pace with the level of inflation that's occurring generally in the economy. And that has worked out reasonably well over 30 and 40-year investments so far, where they stay invested. And therefore, one of the reasons that we haven't yet landed on what the drawdown mechanisms for AE should be is we want to see how that landscape emerges. It's not immediately needed over the next 3-4 years, and therefore we want to see what emerges. Because we do think that the advent of auto-enrolment in the Irish marketplace is going to result in innovation, in product offerings on the retirement side. And so we want to give that chance for the landscape to change and emerge. Own property, income needed if rent and take out a pension or buy your property. I don't consider them exclusive.
No, but they're becoming more exclusive. I was only asking if you done comparisons.
I would suggest the opposite, because rent is as costly as mortgages nowadays. And I know, because I have 2 sons in that age bracket and are looking at how to deal with property and so on, renting is as expensive as buying nowadays. So renting and taking out a pension is no more feasible than mortgage and taking out a pension, I would argue, nowadays. No, you're right in the sense that there is a reduced level of home ownership emerging through the generations. Yeah. And therefore, when it comes to pension age, dealing with that rental requirement is going to be a real issue. And the ESRI has done some analysis and published reports to demonstrate that precisely. But you could argue that that makes it even more imperative that people get into good quality retirement schemes so as they have a better income in retirement.
You certainly need it if you didn't own your own house, but I'd rather own my own house.
And so would I, which is why I do, definitely. But the point is that some people just can't own their own houses.
Yeah, but that goes back, you see.
I can't solve.
I know, but what I'm thinking is that goes back to our consideration, because we have to take a wider lens than the department and just look at it. Your department's working, you're told to look after pensions. We have to look after everybody's life.